Hey guys, tonight, I want you to settle into your pillow, take a slow breath, and let everything around you grow quiet, because we're going to drift far back into the past, to the stone-cold corridors and candlelit halls of a medieval castle. And tonight, instead of exploring the life of kings or knights or nobles, we're going to follow the people who lived behind the grand tapestries, beneath the wooden beams, and under the weight of everyone else's expectations. Tonight, we're re-stepping into the world of the servants, the men and women who kept the entire castle running while the rest of the medieval world slept. So, just relax, breathe gently, and let the soft darkness of the room become the soft darkness of a medieval dawn. Long before anyone rich or powerful has risen from their bed, imagine it is still hours before sunrise, and the castle is surrounded by the deep hush of night, cool and still, except for the faint sound of wind brushing against high stone walls. Somewhere outside, a torch flickers in the breeze, its warm glow barely touching the heavy wooden gates. Inside the castle walls, the very first stirrings of life have already begun, and they are almost always the servants. You've become one of them tonight. You open your eyes, not in your modern bed, but on a simple straw mattress tucked into a small room in the servants' quarters, far from the luxury chambers of the lord and lady. Your blanket is thin, your breath visible in the cold morning air, and everything feels slightly rougher: your clothes, your bedding, your hands. But this is normal, because this is medieval life. Comfort is a luxury, reserved for others. It is still dark. The only light comes from a tiny ember glowing softly in the communal hearth at the end of the room. You can smell firewood and wool and the faint hint of yesterday's stew. Around you, others lie sleeping, some curled beneath cloaks, some wrapped tightly in coarse blankets, all exhausted from the previous day's labor. But you can't stay asleep. You are a castle servant, and servants do not wake when they want to. They wake when they must. You sit up slowly, feeling the chill seep through your clothes. The stone floor beneath your feet is icy, the kind of cold that makes you wince even though you've felt it 1,000 times before. You rub your hands together, trying to coax a little warmth into your skin. Your fingers are stiff, a reminder of long hours spent scrubbing, carrying, lifting, or cooking. A soft sound reaches your ears, the wooden door creaking open. A faint line of torchlight appears in the hallway beyond. The head servant, the one responsible for making sure everyone else does their job, peeks in just long enough to whisper, "Up, it's time." You swallow your tiredness, stand, and dress quickly. The castle is still mostly asleep, with the highborn resting comfortably under thick blankets. But servants must work in silence long before nobles even dream of waking. You step into the corridor. It's narrow and cold, lined with stone walls that carry every footstep like an echo. A torch crackles weakly in its iron bracket, giving off just enough light to see your way but not enough to soften the darkness. You walk carefully, your steps quiet, your breath steady. As you climb a short flight of stairs, you emerge into one of the outer halls of the casella. Long draughty passage carrying the lingering scent of smoke, old rushes on the floor, and the faint aroma of roasted meat from last night's feast. The hall feels deserted yet alive, waiting to be awakened by your hands and the hands of other servants. You hear movement behind you. 2 other servants, rubbing their eyes and yawning, carry buckets of water freshly drawn from the well. Another walks quickly past you with a bundle of firewood in her arms. With every step she takes, tiny pieces of bark fall across the stone. Your first duty is the same as many mornings: rekindle the fires in the great hall. The great hall is the heart of the castle, the place where meals are served, where guests are entertained, where the lord meets with his advisors. Without warmth, the hall would be freezing, the air biting, the stone unbearable to touch. Servants must ensure that by the time nobles step into the hall, it feels alive and welcoming. You push open the heavy wooden door to the great hall. The room is immense, the ceiling high enough that you can barely see the beams in the dim light. The long wooden tables are empty, the benches silent. Tapestries hang along the walls, depicting hunts, battles, legends. Their colors look muted in the morning gloom. The enormous fireplace at the far end is almost out, just a bed of faint red coals glowing beneath cold ash. You kneel in front of the hearth. You begin by carefully shifting the ashes, searching for the warmest embers. Your fingers work quickly, almost automatically. You add thin sticks of kindling first, laying them across the heat, then a few larger pieces of wood. When the fire catches a faint crackle at first, then a gentle flame rising you blow softly to encourage it, watching the orange glow spread across the logs. Slowly, warmth breathes back into the room. As the fire grows stronger, the hall begins to feel less empty, less frozen. A bit of life returns. Other servants join you. One sweeps the floor, gathering the old rushes that cushioned the stone. Another wipes down the tables with a damp cloth, scrubbing away grease from last night's meal. Someone else begins placing fresh rushes on the floor, spreading herbs among them to keep the air sweet: lavender, mint, maybe rosemary if it's available. You continue working in rhythm with them, each task blending into the next. You carry linens to the laundry area, fetch water, and help prepare the kitchen for the morning meal. The castle kitchen is already bustling, the air warm and heavy with smoke. The cook barks orders while stirring a large iron pot of porridge. You assist where needed, grinding grain, carrying wood, washing vegetables. Every servant has their role. Some tend to the stables, others polish armor, others prepare clothing for the noble family. Some scrub floors, some assist the steward with records and finances. All the work you do is essential, but none of it earns praise. And that is the reality of being a servant in a medieval castle. You work, constantly, silently, invisibly. Hours pass, but the day has barely begun. A distant bell sounds soft but clear. It signals that the castle's noble residents will soon be waking. This means everything must be perfect. Fires must be warm, rooms must be clean, breakfast must be ready. You hurry to the upper floors, carrying a bucket of warm water for the lady of the castle. The corridors grow more decorated the higher you climb. Fine tapestries, ornate wooden chests, carved door frames. Everything looks more polished, more refined, and far more cared for than the servant quarters below. You knock softly at the chamber door. Another servant opens it for you. Together, you prepare the room for the lady's morning routine. You place the warm water near her washing stand. Another servant lays out her gown, carefully smoothed, so no wrinkles remain. More servants bring heated stones wrapped in cloths to warm the chamber. When the lady finally rises from her bed, she barely acknowledges any of you, and that is normal. Servants are not meant to be noticed unless something is wrong. You step away quietly, moving to your next task, helping in the storeroom, where barrels of salted fish, wheels of cheese, and sacks of grain need to be checked. You lift heavy lids, inspect contents, and record amounts on a wooden tally board. Later, you carry food from the storeroom to the kitchen. The smell of baking bread fills the air, rich, warm, comforting. You inhale deeply, wishing for a loaf of your own. But your meals will be simpler. Leftover porridge, vegetable stew, coarse bread. The kitchen workers move around quickly, stirring pots, slicing meat, and preparing trays for the Lord's table. The hall will soon fill with chatter, laughter, and eating. But you and the other servants will disappear into the background again, watching from the edges, ready to refill cups, carry plates, or clean spills. You take a moment to stand near the doorway of the great hall, holding a tray of cups. The fire you built earlier is now blazing strong, illuminating the room in warm golden light. Nobles begin to enter, some wrapped in fine cloaks, others already speaking about the day's business. They glance at the tables, the fire, the decorations, all the things you and the other servants worked tirelessly to prepare. But they never ask who prepared them. They never ask who woke before dawn, or whose fingers were numb from cold, or whose back aches from bending and lifting. Servants are supposed to remain unseen. And still, you continue working, not for praise, but because this is your life. This is the rhythm of the castle. Silent effort, endless tasks, constant movement. As breakfast begins and nobles settle into their seats, you quietly step back, returning through the side door toward the kitchen, ready to begin the next set of chores waiting in the long medieval day ahead. The fire burns low but steady, a soft orange pulse in the dim center of the longhouse. And as the night deepens, the world outside seems frozen in time. The wind has calmed for a moment, settling into that heavy, untouched quiet that only winter nights can create. You're still lying on the raised wooden platform, wrapped in layers of wool and fur, and you can feel the slow warmth traveling through the fabric, through the straw beneath you, and into your bones. It's not hot just enough to keep the cold at bay, to let your muscles rest, to let your mind drift. And as you breathe, slowly, gently, you start to notice the rhythm of the longhouse itself. Wood creaks softly as it adjusts to the temperature. Embers pop quietly every few minutes. Somewhere deeper in the shadows, a sleeping animal shifts its weight, letting out a low, warm exhale that spreads into the stillness. These are the sounds that people knew intimately for thousands of years. These were the sounds of survival. When morning approaches in places like this, it doesn't arrive quickly or dramatically. Dawn is slow, shy, almost hesitant. Winter light is weak, and before it fully reaches the longhouse, someone always wakes to tend the fire. In your imagination, that someone rises quietly in the cold darkness, feet touching the floor with a soft thud. They push back their blanket, step toward the center hearth, and kneel beside the embers, cupping their hands around their breath to blow gently. A faint glow brightens. They add small twigs first, then a thicker branch, feeding the fire carefully, like offering nourishment to a living being. Within minutes, the hearth grows stronger, casting new warmth into the room. People depended on this exact ritual every single day. Because winter fires didn't blaze continually, they smoldered. Fuel had to be saved. Wood had to last months. To survive winter, especially in the medieval period, meant knowing exactly how much fuel to use each day. Too much, and you risked running out before spring. Too little, and you faced cold that could take your strength or your life. So every fire was calculated, measured, tended with experience passed down from parents and grandparents. Slowly, the longhouse begins to stir. Someone coughs lightly under their blanket. A child rolls over, mumbling something in half-sleep. The animals shift, their warmth rising like a soft living cloud. When people finally open their eyes, the first thing they feel is the cold air on their face, sharp, but softened by the new fire. And then someone ladles out a simple warm drink from a pot that hung above the hearth all night. Maybe it's watered-down beer, maybe it's a thin broth, maybe it's milk heated just slightly. The warmth spreads through their hands as they hold the cup, and for a moment everything feels still, manageable. Now our journey drifts forward, from this early winter morning in a Norse longhouse into the broader medieval world. Winter survival becomes something shared across continents, across cultures, across time. Whether in Europe, Asia, or the Middle East, people had one thing in common. Winter demanded preparation, creativity, and patience. Imagine yourself traveling slowly through a medieval village now. The longhouse fades behind you, replaced by small timber cottages with thatched roofs and tiny windows covered in horn or oiled cloth. Chimneys were not common yet. Smoke often drifted out through holes in the roof, leaving a faint shadow of soot that stained the rafters over the years. Inside one cottage, a central fire sits in a shallow hearth, just like the one you left behind. Yet each home feels different. Some families hang herbs from the ceiling, drying them for winter remedies. Others store bundles of firewood stacked against the walls, each piece precious. Everything in winter had value. Every twig, every scrap of food, every minute of daylight. The medieval cold wasn't like our cold. Homes were drafty, floors were hard, and insulation was minimal. In many places, there were no glass windows. Instead, the window openings were covered with something called oiled parchment, thin, animal-based material brushed with oil or fat to make it translucent. It allowed a soft, milky light to enter, but blocked wind and snow. And even then, cold still slipped around the edges, snaking into every corner. So clothing became one of the strongest defenses, layer upon layer upon layer. People wore wool because it stayed warm even when damp. Cloaks were thick and fastened with metal or bone pins. Hoods were deep, covering not only the head, but much of the neck and shoulders, creating a small cocoon of warmth. Gloves were simple, but essential. Boots were lined with whatever insulating material could be found: straw, wool, fur. Some people stuffed their boots with dried grass, changing it whenever it became damp from melted snow. If you imagine yourself stepping into a medieval cottage on a winter afternoon, the warmth feels different from modern heating. It doesn't fill the room. It gathers around the central fire, fading quickly the farther you step from the hearth. People understood this instinctively, so life revolved around that warm radius. The family cooked, worked, ate, and gathered within that small circle of heat. Even at night, beds were positioned as close to the warmest spot as possible. And those beds, they were not the soft mattresses we know today. A medieval bed was a wooden frame filled with straw or reeds, covered with blankets made from wool or fur. Straw absorbed moisture, so it was changed often to prevent rot and insects. When you lay in one, you could feel the slight rustle beneath you, a reminder of how simple life once was. And yet, these beds were warmer than the cold floor. warmer than the open air outside, warmer than anything except the fire. Couples slept close, families slept close, children huddled near their parents, because sharing body heat was a natural, necessary part of winter. As the day outside grows colder again, the medieval village settles into its winter rhythm. Livestock are kept in stable buildings beside the home, or even partially within the same structure. Their warmth adds a few precious degrees to the air. Chickens fluff themselves into round little shapes. Goats nibble hay. Cows exhale slow warm breaths that mist in the cold. These simple creatures unknowingly helped humans survive. Now imagine traveling farther south, to places where winter wasn't as severe but still meaningful, villages in the Mediterranean or the Middle East. Here, homes were often built from stone or clay, which retained heat differently. In some places, families built their winter rooms on the upper floors, where rising heat collected. Fireplaces with chimneys became more common in later medieval centuries, making heating more efficient. Still, even in these warmer regions, people relied on thick woolen clothing, braziers filled with glowing coals, and tightly sealed doors to keep warmth inside. One interesting thing about medieval winter is that people accepted the cold in a way we rarely do today. They didn't expect to feel warm all the time. Instead, they focused on protecting the most important parts of the body: the head, hands, feet, and core. As long as those were kept warm, people believed they could endure almost anything, and they did. In wealthier homes, tapestries hung from stone walls, not just as decoration but as insulation. Layers of thick woven fabric captured warm air and blocked drafts, making large rooms feel more comfortable. Beneath your feet, rush mats softened the cold stone floors. In grand manor houses or castles, multiple fireplaces kept certain rooms warmer, though even castles were cold by modern standards. Stone walls absorbed chill, and large open spaces were nearly impossible to heat fully. Servants often slept in hallways or near kitchens, where heat from the day's work lingered the longest. And as the evening approaches in this medieval world, people gather again around the fire. Someone stirs a pot of stew, thick, warm, comforting. Someone else repairs a pair of shoes, threading leather carefully. Children listen to stories again, their eyes heavy with sleep. The fire crackles, casting long shadows across the room. A soft hum of conversation blends with the quiet rhythm of winter outside. Slowly, the night deepens once more, and just like the people of the ancient world, the medieval villagers wait for morning, for the light to return, for another chance to face the cold, with patience and endurance. Winter is long, but humans have always been resilient. The fire burns low but steady, a soft orange pulse in the dim center of the longhouse. And as the night deepens, the world outside seems frozen in time. The wind has calmed for a moment, settling into that heavy, untouched quiet that only winter nights can create. You're still lying on the raised wooden platform, wrapped in layers of wool and fur, and you can feel the slow warmth traveling through the fabric, through the straw beneath you, and into your bones. It's not hot just enough to keep the cold at bay, to let your muscles rest, to let your mind drift. And as you breathe, slowly, gently, you start to notice the rhythm of the longhouse itself. Wood creaks softly as it adjusts to the temperature. Embers pop quietly every few minutes. Somewhere deeper in the shadows, a sleeping animal shifts its weight, letting out a low, warm exhale that spreads into the stillness. These are the sounds that people knew intimately for thousands of years. These were the sounds of survival. When morning approaches in places like this, it doesn't arrive quickly or dramatically. Dawn is slow, shy, almost hesitant. Winter light is weak, and before it fully reaches the longhouse, someone always wakes to tend the fire. In your imagination, that someone rises quietly in the cold darkness, feet touching the floor with a soft thud. They push back their blanket, step toward the center hearth, and kneel beside the embers, cupping their hands around their breath to blow gently. A faint glow brightens. They add small twigs first, then a thicker branch, feeding the fire carefully like offering nourishment to a living being. Within minutes, the hearth grows stronger, casting new warmth into the room. People depended on this exact ritual every single day. Because winter fires didn't blaze continually, they smoldered. Fuel had to be saved. Wood had to last months. To survive winter, especially in the medieval period, meant knowing exactly how much fuel to use each day. Too much, and you risked running out before spring. Too little, and you faced cold that could take your strength or your life. So every fire was calculated, measured, tended with experience passed down from parents and grandparents. Slowly, the longhouse begins to stir. Someone coughs lightly under their blanket. A child rolls over, mumbling something in half sleep. The animals shift, their warmth rising like a soft living cloud. When people finally open their eyes, the first thing they feel is the cold air on their face, sharp, but softened by the new fire. And then someone ladles out a simple warm drink from a pot that hung above the hearth all night. Maybe it's watered down beer, maybe it's a thin broth, maybe it's milk heated just slightly. The warmth spreads through their hands as they hold the cup, and for a moment everything feels still, manageable. Now our journey drifts forward, from this early winter morning in a Norse longhouse into the broader medieval world. Winter survival becomes something shared across continents, across cultures, across time. Whether in Europe, Asia, or the Middle East, people had one thing in common. Winter demanded preparation, creativity, and patience. Imagine yourself traveling slowly through a medieval village now. The longhouse fades behind you, replaced by small timber cottages with thatched roofs and tiny windows covered in horn or oiled cloth. Chimneys were not common yet. Smoke often drifted out through holes in the roof, leaving a faint shadow of soot that stained the rafters over the years. Inside one cottage, a central fire sits in a shallow hearth, just like the one you left behind. Yet each home feels different. Some families hang herbs from the ceiling, drying them for winter remedies. Others store bundles of firewood stacked against the walls, each piece precious. Everything in winter had value. Every twig, every scrap of food, every minute of daylight. The medieval cold wasn't like our cold. Homes were drafty, floors were hard, and insulation was minimal. In many places, there were no glass windows. Instead, the window openings were covered with something called oiled parchment, thin, animal-based material brushed with oil or fat to make it translucent. It allowed a soft, milky light to enter but blocked wind and snow. And even then, cold still slipped around the edges, snaking into every corner. So clothing became one of the strongest defenses, layer upon layer upon layer. People wore wool because it stayed warm even when damp. Cloaks were thick and fastened with metal or bone pins. Hoods were deep, covering not only the head but much of the neck and shoulders, creating a small cocoon of warmth. Gloves were simple but essential. Boots were lined with whatever insulating material could be found: straw, wool, fur. Some people stuffed their boots with dried grass, changing it whenever it became damp from melted snow. If you imagine yourself stepping into a medieval cottage on a winter afternoon, the warmth feels different from modern heating. It doesn't fill the room. It gathers around the central fire, fading quickly the farther you step from the hearth. People understood this instinctively, so life revolved around that warm radius. The family cooked, worked, ate, and gathered within that small circle of heat. Even at night, beds were positioned as close to the warmest spot as possible. And those beds, they were not the soft mattresses we know today. A medieval bed was a wooden frame filled with straw or reeds, covered with blankets made from wool or fur. Straw absorbed moisture, so it was changed often to prevent rot and insects. When you lay in one, you could feel the slight rustle beneath you, a reminder of how simple life once was. And yet, these beds were warmer than the cold floor, warmer than the open air outside, warmer than anything except the fire. Couples slept close, families slept close, children huddled near their parents, because sharing body heat was a natural, necessary part of winter. As the day outside grows colder again, the medieval village settles into its winter rhythm. Livestock are kept in stable buildings beside the home, or even partially within the same structure. Their warmth adds a few precious degrees to the air. Chickens fluff themselves into round little shapes. Goats nibble hay. Cows exhale slow warm breaths that mist in the cold. These simple creatures unknowingly helped humans survive. Now imagine traveling farther south, to places where winter wasn't as severe but still meaningful villages in the Mediterranean or the Middle East. Here, homes were often built from stone or clay, which retained heat differently. In some places, families built their winter rooms on the upper floors, where rising heat collected. Fireplaces with chimneys became more common in later medieval centuries, making heating more efficient. Still, even in these warmer regions, people relied on thick woolen clothing, braziers filled with glowing coals, and tightly sealed doors to keep warmth inside. One interesting thing about medieval winter is that people accepted the cold in a way we rarely do today. They didn't expect to feel warm all the time. Instead, they focused on protecting the most important parts of the body: the head, hands, feet, and core. As long as those were kept warm, people believed they could endure almost anything, and they did. In wealthier homes, tapestries hung from stone walls, not just as decoration but as insulation. Layers of thick woven fabric captured warm air and blocked drafts, making large rooms feel more comfortable. Beneath your feet, rush mats softened the cold stone floors. In grand manor houses or castles, multiple fireplaces kept certain rooms warmer, though even castles were cold by modern standards. Stone walls absorbed chill, and large open spaces were nearly impossible to heat fully. Servants often slept in hallways or near kitchens, where heat from the day's work lingered the longest. And as the evening approaches in this medieval world, people gather again around the fire. Someone stirs a pot of stew, thick, warm, comforting. Someone else repairs a pair of shoes, threading leather carefully. Children listen to stories again, their eyes heavy with sleep. The fire crackles, casting long shadows across the room. A soft hum of conversation blends with the quiet rhythm of winter outside. Slowly, the night deepens once more, and just like the people of the ancient world, the medieval villagers wait for morning, for the light to return, for another chance to face the cold, with patience and endurance. Winter is long, but humans have always been resilient. The warmth seeps slowly into your hands, gentle and patient, the kind of warmth that feels alive, like it's breathing with you. The fire crackles softly, sending tiny sparks upward that fade before they reach the dark wooden beams overhead. Around you, the air is thick with the smell of burning oak and wool and earth, a combination so ancient, so familiar, that humans once carried it with them everywhere. This warmth, this firelight, this soft glow was the center of life, the quiet anchor that held families through long winters. As you sit near the hearth, the world outside wraps itself in deeper shadow. The cottage walls feel almost like the inside of a shell, holding back the cold, holding in the soft murmur of human breath, holding together everything that mattered on a winter night. People didn't expect comfort the way we do today. They expected endurance. And so every night spent by a fire like this was a small triumph, a quiet promise that the cold would not win. Your eyes follow the embers as they shift and glow, and as they move, the centuries shift with them. The medieval cottage around you begins to blur, its edges softening until you feel yourself moving through time again, drifting to other winters, other fires, other ways people survived when the world was frozen. Now, imagine stepping outside again, but this time into a different landscape, rolling hills covered in frost, a faint mist curling around bare trees, the sky a pale, delicate grey. This is the winter of the early Middle Ages, the centuries after Rome's fall, when Europe was reshaping itself slowly, village by village, farm by farm, kingdom by kingdom. The world was quieter then, roads less traveled, cities smaller, forests larger, and winter a force that shaped everything. Homes in this era, very timber cottages, sod houses built partly into the earth, round huts, even stone dwellings in some regions. But they all had the same heartbeat, a fire at the center. Imagine stepping into an early medieval farmhouse now. The door creaks softly as you push it open, letting in a thin blade of icy air. Inside, the family huddles close to the hearth. A pot hangs over the flames, bubbling gently with something simple, maybe barley, maybe cabbage, maybe dried peas. The air is smoky, warm, and dim. In many places, smoke darkened the ceiling beams over generations, coating them in thick black soot. But no one complained. That soot meant the fire had burned for decades, keeping people alive through countless icy nights. Children learned early how to blow on embers, how to arrange firewood to burn slowly, how to protect a flame from the wind. Firemaking was a skill, an art, a responsibility. In this world, heating wasn't only about the hearth. People prepared for winter long before winter arrived. They filled storage pits with grain, sealed tightly against moisture. They dried fish and meat, smoked it carefully so it would last through months of darkness. They harvested honey, milked animals before they dried out for the season, made cheese that could be stored, and brewed ale because water could freeze or become unsafe. Everything was done with winter in mind. Step back outside and imagine walking through a small medieval village. Frost sparkles on rooftops like scattered stars. Smoke trails gently from every home, rising into the pale morning sky. Roads are quiet. Only the crunch of your boots breaks the silence. A farmer leads a small group of animals out briefly. They need movement even in winter. Their breath fogs the air, joining yours in soft white puffs. Winter wasn't a season people escaped. It was a season they lived alongside. And as you walk, your mind drifts to those who lived even farther north, where winter was harsher, darker, and longer than anywhere else the Nordic and Baltic regions. There, people didn't simply endure winter. They embraced it as part of their identity. Imagine walking through a Norse settlement again, but now in the full depth of winter. Snow piles high against the sides of longhouses, almost insulating them. The roofs are heavy with frost. The sun, when it rises at all, lingers low on the horizon, casting long shadows that stretch across frozen ground. Inside the longhouse, the heat feels different, not warm exactly, but protective. The air is smoky. The fire stretches in a long line down the center. Families, animals, tools, and supplies all share the same space. Every movement is careful and purposeful. People sit close together, wrapped in thick woolen cloaks. They mend fishing nets, carve wooden bowls, sharpen tools, and tell stories of the ancestors, of gods, of kings, whose names echo through the ages. Winter, in these lands, was a time of memory and myth, a time when stories became warmth, when legends were as necessary as blankets. You walk quietly along the raised platform, feeling the soft give of straw beneath your boots, listening to the low hum of winter life inside this great wooden hall. Outside, the cold is a silent force pressing against the walls, but inside, the glow of the fire holds it back with patient strength. Now imagine drifting farther east to the Slavic regions, where winter could be equally unforgiving. Homes were built low to the ground, with thick walls of logs carefully fitted together. The fireplaces here were often large stoves, made from clay or stone, able to retain heat for hours, sometimes even days. These stoves doubled as sleeping platforms. Their flat surfaces stayed warm long after the fire was out. Imagine climbing onto one at night, the warm clay radiating heat into your back, your legs, your hands. It was like sleeping on a large, gentle animal that held you through the night. Families would gather around these stoves, cooking, sleeping, talking, and waiting for the cold to pass. In other places, like the high mountains of the Alps, winter's survival meant something slightly different. People built homes with steep roofs to shed snow, thick stone walls, and small windows. They stored hay in lofts above the animals, so the warmth from livestock rose into the upper living areas. Imagine stepping into one of these alpine homes. You hear cows shifting below, bells jingling softly. Their warmth rises upward. Wooden floors vibrate gently under your feet. The fire in the small stone hearth burns bright, and the smell of wood smoke mixes with the scent of warm milk, wool, and pine. Every region had its own winter knowledge. Every family had its own winter secrets. And over centuries, these quiet inventions, warm stones, layered wool, shared heat, smoke-dried beams, community fires, clay stoves, thatched insulation became the foundation of survival. Now imagine the medieval night slowly deepening again, the world returning to its dark winter stillness. You find yourself once more inside that small cottage from before, the one where you first sat by the fire. The family is settling down for sleep. Blankets are layered heavily. A small dog circles near the warmest place on the floor before curling into a tight little ball. The fire is allowed to shrink to embers, glowing like red jewels in the dimness. Someone stirs one last time, adjusts a pot so it stays warm through the night, and then settles beneath their blanket. The cottage becomes quiet, save for the occasional crack of cooling wood or the faint sigh of the wind outside. And you sit there for a moment longer, watching the last flickers of flame dance against the walls. The calm settles into your chest, slow and steady. You can almost feel the winter pressing gently around the home, and the warm air pushing back just enough to keep everything safe. Winter, in these times, was a reminder of how fragile life was, and yet how strong people could be when they came together, when they shared warmth, when they trusted the fire to carry them through another night. And the winter night stretches on, drifting deeper into a silence so complete that even the faintest breath of wind seems like a wandering spirit moving across the frozen world. The people huddle closer to one another, drawing their cloaks tighter. The fires glow, painting their faces with a soft, flickering gold. The flames rise and fall in slow waves, each motion like a heartbeat, steady and reassuring, in a world where warmth is precious and the night is long. Outside, the snow settles gently, layer upon layer, creating a blanket that muffles sound and turns the whole landscape into something dreamlike and distant, as though the world has been placed under a spell. Within the shelter of their simple home, the family begins to drift in and out of light sleep, lulled by the rhythm of crackling wood and warm breath. Someone shifts slightly, adjusting a woolen covering, while another murmurs in a dream, a soft and meaningless sound that quickly dissolves back into the darkness. These winter nights were slow, unhurried things, hours stretching endlessly, giving everyone a sense of time not as something to chase, but something to endure, something to move through gently like a long, quiet river. Long before the idea of modern heating existed, people understood that survival in winter was a communal effort. No one warmed themselves alone. They relied not only on the fire and the shelter around them, but also on one another, sharing warmth, sharing breath, sharing comfort. It is strange to imagine now, in a world where a single switch can fill an entire home with warmth. But for most of human history, heat was something earned, harvested from forests, coaxed from flint and tinder, tended with careful hands that understood how much lives depended on that single, glowing core of flame. As the hours went on, the fire would fade, dipping into a dull red glow, but someone always had to rise. Usually the lightest sleeper, or the one closest to the hearth, would stir, senses sharpened by routine rather than alertness. They would gently feed the fire with a few more pieces of wood, careful not to wake the others. The new logs caught slowly, the crackle whispering back to life, and the room would warm just enough for the cold to back away from the door and the frost to remain creeping only on the outside. Beyond these small shelters, the winter landscape itself had its own life. Wolves prowled the edges of the forests, their breath misting in pale tendrils as they searched for food beneath the deep snow. Deer huddled under the boughs of evergreen trees where the snowfall was thinnest, their bodies trembling with the effort of staying warm. Birds tucked their heads beneath their wings, finding refuge in hollow trees or abandoned nests thickened with moss. Everything alive moved a little slower, breathed a little quieter, and dreamed a little deeper under the weight of winter's presence. In medieval villages, it was common for neighbors to share not just food but warmth. People whose homes were too small or too cold would sometimes gather in a single dwelling where a larger hearth could support many. They slept together on straw bedding, layered with furs, boots tucked near the fire so they wouldn't freeze stiff by morning. The heavy scent of smoke hung deep in the air, not unpleasant but familiar. The smell of safety, of life, continuing in the middle of the coldest months. There were always tasks that needed tending, even in winter. Animal stalls had to be checked to make sure the livestock were warm enough to survive. Children were sent out only briefly, wrapped in whatever spare fabric the household had, their noses red and their breaths puffing like tiny clouds. They carried water from frozen wells, their fingers numb despite mittens. But they understood that winter did not pause simply because the world outside was harsh. Everyone performed their duties, but always quickly, always with a mind toward returning to the fire that waited inside. Travelers passing through harsh winters experienced an even deeper level of hardship. They wrapped themselves in layers upon layers of wool and fur, their steps crunching through snow that reached their knees. Sometimes they followed the glow of distant hearth fires, hoping to find shelter, knocking on doors as though each one was a lifeline. Hospitality was not merely kindness during these times, it was survival. A traveler turned away in the dead of winter might not live to see morning. So even the poorest families tried to offer what they could: a place near the fire, a cup of warm broth, a corner of the floor to sleep on. In ancient times, before medieval hearths, the winter nights were even more precarious. In small tribal groups, people gathered inside circular huts built from wood, earth, or reeds, their roofs low to trap rising heat. Fires burned in central pits with holes in the roof to let the smoke escape, though it rarely escaped entirely. The air was always thick with the warm, dusty scent of burning wood, smoke curling round the room in lazy spirals that clung to clothing and skin. The people slept close to the fire's glow, their breathing slow, the flickering light dancing across painted walls or carved wooden supports. They murmured stories to each other, myths of sun gods returning after winter, tales of spirits that roamed the snowy world outside, and legends of warmth returning like a long-lost friend. Winter rituals too were born from this darkness, because the long nights made people feel that the world was holding its breath. They believed that warmth itself had a spirit, something that needed to be tended, honored, protected. Small offerings of grain or herbs were sometimes thrown into the flames, the crackle a sign that the offering was accepted. Families whispered prayers into the glowing coals, asking for the safe return of spring, for their animals to live, for no sickness to creep into the home during the cold months when a simple fever could become dangerous. As the winter deepened, the world outside seemed to slow to an almost dreamlike stillness. Frozen rivers no longer flowed but became white, silent roads stretching through the land. Frost gathered like lace on the edges of every surface, each delicate pattern a reminder of nature's quiet artistry. Even the moonlight seemed colder, sharper, illuminating the snow with a pale glow that shimmered like distant stars fallen to the ground. The night felt endless sometimes, the days brief and dim, the sun too weak to chase away the chill. Inside, though life continued with gentle rhythms, women spun wool near the fire, their fingers moving by memory rather than sight. Men repaired tools, their silhouettes dark against the firelight. Children whispered stories to each other, their voices soft and drowsy. The sound of the hearth was like a comforting lullaby, rising and falling, always steady, as though reminding everyone that no matter how deep the cold grew, the fire would continue to burn as long as they kept feeding it. And still the winter nights stretched on, mile after mile of darkness, hour after hour of quiet. People took turns sleeping lightly, tending the fire, listening to the wind's distant calls, feeling the weight of their blankets and the warmth of shared breath. The knowledge of survival lay not in any grand moment, but in these repeating rituals, the careful tending of embers, the slow warming of hands, the steady companionship that kept fear at bay. In those days, winter was not something to conquer, but something to flow through, gently, patiently, like a slow river that could not be rushed. Even now, centuries later, a part of that ancient rhythm lingers. Whenever we sit beside a fire on a cold night, watching the flames flicker and listening to the distant hush outside, we echo the same rituals that kept countless generations alive. The winter night stretches on, yes, but the warmth continues to a golden thread carried through time, woven into the hearts of those who endured the cold with quiet determination and shared breath. Woven into the hearts of those who endured the cold with quiet determination and shared breath. And as the firelight continued its soft, unhurried flicker, another layer of the winter night unfolded, a layer that stretched far beyond the walls of a single home, reaching into the deeper routines of ancient and medieval communities who learned, generation after generation, how to live with the cold rather than fight it. Outside, the snow lay thick along the quiet paths, covering the earth like a pale blanket, and in the distant dark, the occasional groan of shifting ice echoed like an old memory stirring in its sleep. People in those past centuries understood winter in a way we rarely do now. They saw it not as an interruption to life, but as a season of waiting, a season of reflection, a season where everything slowed, even their thoughts. The cold seemed to hush the mind, turning every breath into something purposeful, every step into something measured. The warmth they gathered wasn't simply heat, it was comfort, companionship, and the reassurance that the world might sleep, but it would wake again. In many medieval households, winter evenings were times of quiet industry. As the fire glowed low and deep, people moved around it, like part of a gentle ritual. A mother might be carding wool, the soft fibers whispering against wooden combs, slowly preparing the material that would later be spun into thread. A father might be repairing a cloak, the needle glinting briefly in the fire's breath before disappearing into the cloth once more. Children lay half asleep, wrapped in furs, listening to the steady rhythm of adult hands working, the sound becoming part of the lullaby of winter. Every action mattered in these months, when warmth was precious. Clothes were worn thicker, layered carefully. Cloaks were lined with fur, boots stuffed with straw or wool to keep toes from freezing. Even small tricks were passed down through generations, tucking warm stones from the hearth into cloth and placing them at one's feet before bed, or hanging a damp garment near the fire to create a burst of warm humidity that eased dry throats. Each detail helped, and none were taken lightly. Beyond the home, winter demanded constant awareness. Families checked roofs often to sweep off heavy snow so it wouldn't collapse the wooden beams. They listened for the telltale drip of ice melting in the wrong corner, a warning of potential leaks. They stored food high off the ground, away from cold patches and curious animals. Every day brought a small list of tasks that became rhythm rather than burden, a slow dance with nature's chill. Villages too developed patterns that shaped winter life. Paths between homes were kept open with steady footsteps packing down snow until it formed smooth. Narrow corridors that village dogs and children alike ran through like winding tunnels. Communal wells were visited daily, their surfaces broken open with wooden poles to reach the dark, living water beneath. If a traveler approached the village, their silhouette dim beneath the pale sky, someone always called out to ensure they meant no harm, but rarely would anyone be turned away on a frozen night. Winter softened even the hardest hearts. Among the forests, winter changed the very character of the land. Trees stood still and tall, their branches heavy with layers of white frost that glowed faintly in the moonlight. The frozen streams gleamed like ribbons of pale glass winding through the trees. Even the animals moved differently, quieter, slower, more cautious, as though they understood that the world's sharp edges grew sharper in winter. A misstep could cost them precious energy. A failure to find food could mean starvation. Winter was a teacher, stern but fair, and all living things learned from it. People, too, told stories about winter to help them understand its depths. Around the hearth, with the light casting warm halos around every face, tales were whispered about spirits that wandered across snowfields, their shapes barely seen through drifting white flurries. There were legends of frost giants from the far north, said to bring the first cold breath of winter, and myths of fire guardians who protected families from freezing nights as long as they honored their hearth. Children listened wide-eyed, their imaginations drifting as smoothly as the snow outside, believing that winter was more than a season. It was a presence, a being, something alive in the world around them. And yet, for all the hardships, winter held small beauties. Icicles formed in perfect rows along roof edges, catching the sunlight like crystal daggers. Hoarfrost etched delicate patterns along wooden doors and fence posts, each design unique, each shimmering in morning light, as if it had been painted there by some careful hand. The nights were longer, yes, but the stars glowed brighter, undisturbed by warmth rising from the earth. The sky felt colder, clearer, almost sharp in its brilliance. People looked upward more often in winter, perhaps because the darkness above seemed so vast, so infinite, so full of breathless quiet. During especially harsh winters, when storms churned across the land like giants roaming the sky, communities prepared together. They brought livestock indoors to share warmth with the family, the steam of their breath adding gentle humidity to the frigid air. They filled every gap in the walls they could find, stuffing straw or wool into cracks where cold tried to creep through. Windows, if a home had any in that age, were covered with animal skins or wooden shutters to keep out the frost. The sound of wind pushing against these shutters became a familiar tune, like something ancient calling from beyond the walls. Food, too, shaped winter life. Preserved meats hung from rafters, smoke-cured to last the season. Vegetables stored in cool cellars, waited silently in woven baskets. Barley, oats, and dried fruits were cherished ingredients used sparingly to make porridge or thick soups that warmed the body from the inside out. Sometimes dried herbs were added, their scent rising in gentle waves, reminding everyone of warmer months when the earth was generous and green. Each bite held memory and hope. Those who lived near rivers or lakes sometimes cut holes in the ice to catch fish swimming sluggishly beneath. It was dangerous work, slippery, cold, and always at risk of cracking ice, but the reward could be the difference between hunger and strength. The fish would be cooked slowly over low flames, the smell filling the home with a rich promise of nourishment. But even as families worked, ate, slept, and waited for winter to loosen its grip, they held on to one truth: winter was never permanent. It was a cycle, as old as time, meant to be endured, not feared. And as long as they leaned on one another, shared warmth, kept fires alive, and moved gently through these long nights, they knew they would see spring again. Sometimes, late in the night, someone would rise and open a small crack in the door, just to breathe the cold air. It hit with a sharpness that felt somehow cleansing, the kind of chill that carried the distant scent of snow-covered earth. The sky above, dark and unending, spread like a vast, quiet ocean. It made a person feel small, but not in a fearful way, rather in a way that connected them to something bigger, something timeless. These silent moments reminded them that winter had watched over countless generations before them, and would watch over countless generations after. Inside, the fire whispered and glowed, casting the room in amber softness. Someone shifted beneath their blankets. Someone sighed in sleep. Someone murmured a small, half-formed thought that drifted away like smoke. Life continued in slow breaths, warm and quiet, while outside, winter ruled the land with its frozen touch. And still, the night stretched on, as though time itself had decided to move more slowly in the cold, letting each moment drift like a flake of snow spiraling gently toward the quiet earth. Inside the dim glow of the home, the hearth hummed a soft lullaby of crackles, the embers settling deeper into a bed of orange light. The warmth spread outward in slow waves, touching the faces of those sleeping nearby, brushing their cheeks like a gentle hand. These were the hours when the world seemed to draw into itself, small and sheltered, wrapped in a sense of fragile calm that winter alone could create. Beyond the walls, the cold deepened. Frost crept along the edges of stones, forming delicate white lace that shimmered beneath the faint moonlight. Trees stood as tall, silent sentinels, their branches heavy, drooping with the weight of newly fallen snow. The stars above flickered against the ink-black sky, sharp and distant, shining with a kind of clarity only winter nights could summon. Even the wind moved with caution, brushing softly across the land, stirring loose flakes into small, wandering ghosts of white. Inside the home, warmth was a treasure guarded with care. Someone stirred near the fire, lifting a log and placing it gently on the glowing embers, watching as it caught with a whisper of sparks. The light grew, stretching its fingers across the room, illuminating wooden beams overhead and the worn textures of blankets below. The flames danced slowly, as though tired from the long night, their shapes bending and curling in rhythms old as time. In medieval winters, these quiet hours were spent listening to the fire, to each other's breathing, to the world outside. People had a deep awareness of sound in winter, because everything was amplified. A crack of ice shifting along a distant river could echo for miles. The cry of an owl overhead felt like a message carried from one patch of darkness to another. Even the soft fall of snow had a presence, a kind of hush that wrapped itself around every surface and seemed to whisper that the world had gone to sleep. Families depended on these shared nights to strengthen bonds, to tell stories, to sing softly, to pray, a slow whisper of warmth waiting somewhere beyond the dark. And in that quiet space between night and dawn, the world seemed to rest more deeply, as though all the cold, all the silence, all the shadows were gathering themselves for a moment of stillness before the faintest hint of light returned. Inside the shelter, the fire breathed softly, its glow steady, the embers pulsing like the heartbeat of the home. The people lying near it shifted under their blankets, moving almost in unison, as if they were part of the same dream drifting through the room. Outside, the cold thickened until the very air felt heavy, each breath turning to pale mist that lingered for a moment before dissolving into the dark. Snowflakes, fine and powdery now, drifted slowly from the sky, moving with such gentleness that they seemed less like falling snow and more like small pieces of the night, settling quietly onto the earth. The stillness grew deeper, a kind of hush that seeped into every corner of the world, making even the faintest sound feel precious and rare. In ancient times, people believed that winter nights held secrets, whispered messages carried on the bites of wind, stories hidden in drifting snow, signs traced subtly in the frost that curled along wooden beams. They imagined that the darkness itself watched over them, not with malice, but with a solemn vigilance, ensuring that those who honored the cold and respected its power would be granted the strength to see spring once more. And perhaps, in some quiet way, this belief kept them warm, not in the body, but in the spirit, giving them courage during the longest hours of the night. Inside the small dwelling, the air carried the aroma of the fire, mixed with faint traces of dried herbs that hung overhead, bundles gathered during warmer days and saved for winter's long months. Their scents drifted idly on the warm currents rising from the hearth: lavender, rosemary, mint, each note subtle and fleeting, bringing soft memories of sunlight and open fields. Sometimes the scent of old wood joined them, the beams of the shelter warming ever so slightly as the fire's heat brushed against them, releasing a rich, quiet fragrance of age and endurance. As the fire hummed, someone near the hearth shifted again, pulling their cloak more tightly around their shoulders. Their breathing deepened, settling into the slow rhythm of someone drifting in and out of sleep. These winter nights encouraged such half-dreaming states, a liminal space where thoughts wandered loosely between present and memory. People might dream of warmer days, of earth beneath their feet rather than snow, of rivers running instead of frozen still. They might remember the faces of those who had shared such nights before them, or imagine the faces of those who had come after, continuing the same ancient rituals of tending fires and surviving dark winters. In medieval villages, nights like these were often accompanied by soft murmurs of old stories. Elders might whisper legends about ancient winters, ones so fierce that wolves came down from the mountains in great numbers, their howls echoing across the land, or tales of winters where the sun seemed to vanish for days at a time, leaving the world trapped in a twilight that never fully brightened. But alongside these stories of harshness were tales of resilience, of hunters who braved the cold to bring back food, of mothers who kept fires alive for weeks without letting them die, of travelers who found shelter in unexpected places and survived because of the kindness of strangers. In some places, winter nights were also times of quiet ritual. Families might place a small bowl of grain near the hearth, a symbolic offering to the spirits of warmth, meant to bring protection through the coldest months. Children learned to respect these rituals. Even if they didn't fully understand them, they knew that anything which kept their homes safe and warm was worth honoring. And so the small bowl sat by the fire, untouched but ever present, a reminder that winter required both effort and humility. Beyond the home's walls, the landscape shifted in subtle ways as the night deepened. Frost grew thicker on branches, forming crystalline patterns that sparkled faintly in the moonlight. The snowpack settled with soft sighing sounds, tiny shifts in the landscape that created the illusion of the earth breathing beneath its heavy blanket. The faint sound of a distant owl occasionally drifted through the dark, its call long and melodic, echoing through the silent trees. Even the stars overhead seemed to shimmer with a different kind of light, sharper, colder, more intense, as though they themselves were enduring the long winter beside the earth. People who lived through such winters became experts in reading the sky, the snow, and the wind. They knew that a certain crispness in the air meant a storm was coming. They knew that stars blurring slightly behind a thin veil of cloud meant moisture gathering above. They knew the way snow felt underfoot, soft or crusted, powdery or dense, and what each texture meant for the days ahead. A whole language of winter existed, unspoken but understood by those who lived close to nature. Inside the home, one of the sleepers stirred awake, perhaps because the fire had dipped, or because a draught slipped through a crack in the wall. They sat up slowly, rubbing their hands together, letting the hush of the night envelope them. They reached for another log, choosing one that had dried for many months, its surface pale and smooth. When they placed it on the fire, sparks rose in soft bursts, like tiny stars leaping into the shadowed air, before fading. The new wood caught, flames curling along its edges, growing brighter until the darkness faded back from the room's corners. The warmth crept outward again, brushing against everyone resting nearby. A child murmured something unintelligible in their sleep, shifting closer to a parent's side. The soft movement of fur blankets rustled gently, blending with the fire's rhythm, creating a quiet harmony that seemed to cradle the entire room. Moments like this were the heartbeats of winter, small, unremarkable, yet profoundly tender in their simplicity. The one who had risen remained awake for a while, listening to the world beyond the walls. The silence felt deep, almost tangible, the kind of quiet that made every sound meaningful. They could hear the faint groans of wooden beams contracting in the cold, the gentle sweep of falling snow against the roof, the whisper of wind brushing past the shutter. These sounds, far from alarming, were familiar companions in winter's long months, each one telling its own story. The world outside was cold, but the home held fast. The night was long, but the fire still burned. As they sat near the hearth, gazing into the glowing coals, their mind drifted to memories of winters past. They remembered sitting in this same place as a child, watching their mother tend the fire with patient hands. They recalled the stories told on nights just like this, tales of ancestors who weathered winters in huts made of earth and wood, their fires burning in open pits, smoke drifting through small holes in the roof. They thought of the countless hands that had tended fires through the centuries, each flame linking one generation to the next. The warmth they felt now was part of an ancient chain, stretching back through time, connecting them to people long gone and to those yet to come. Eventually, drowsiness returned, a heavy but gentle pull. They lay down again, trusting the fire to keep watch for a while. And as sleep washed over them, the world settled deeper into silence. The snow outside thickened, falling in soft, endless waves. The night leaned further into its stillness, unfurling slowly like a long, pale ribbon across the frozen land. Every creature, every tree, every drifting flake of snow seemed wrapped in the same quiet spell, a spell woven from patience, endurance, and the slow passage of time. And somewhere far above, the stars continued their steady vigil, shining down upon the sleeping earth, cold but constant, distant but watchful. The night held on, the cold lingered, the fire breathed, and winter continued its ancient, solemn journey toward the light that waited just beyond the horizon. The light that waited just beyond the horizon. Yet for now, the horizon remained hidden beneath layers of drifting cloud, the world wrapped in its long, patient slumber. The cold pressed quietly against the walls of the shelter, not with cruelty but with a steady, unyielding presence, as if reminding everyone inside that winter had its own slow rhythm, its own ancient cadence, and nothing could rush it forward. Inside, the fire continued its soft breathing, glowing faintly beneath a layer of ash. Every few moments a faint crackle whispered through the room, a delicate sound that blended seamlessly with the warmth and the whispering quiet. The embers pulsed gently, casting a warm glow across the faces of those sleeping nearby, illuminating the gentle rise and fall of their breaths. The warmth gathered in pockets around the hearth, drifting outward in slow waves that thinned as they reached the far edges of the dwelling, leaving the corners cool and shadowed. Outside, the snow had grown deeper, smoothing the landscape into soft, rounded shapes. Trees bowed under the weight of fresh snow, their branches sagging gently, creating curves and arches that looked almost sculpted. The world had become a vast, silent tapestry of white, each detail softened, each harsh line erased. Even distant hills had lost their sharpness, appearing more like gentle silhouettes beneath the muted sky. People in ancient and medieval times knew this silence intimately. They understood that winter was not just a season, it was a presence, something that wrapped around their lives, shaping their days and nights. They knew that survival meant respecting this presence, working with it rather than against it. It was a time for patience, for careful planning, for conserving energy and warmth. Every action mattered, every decision carried weight. In the shelter, a soft rustle broke the quiet as someone stirred once more. Their eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dim, amber glow of the fire. They could feel the familiar heaviness of cold lingering at the edges of the room, the contrast between warmth and chill brushing gently over their skin. Reaching out a hand, they felt for a nearby fur cloak and pulled it closer, wrapping it around their shoulders as they sat up. For a few moments, they simply listened. The hush of the night pressed gently at the walls, the faintest whisper of wind seeping through small cracks. They could hear the soft breathing of their family, each rhythm steady and calm. The fire murmured quietly, shifting slightly as a piece of wood settled deeper into the embers. These sounds, though subtle, filled the space like a lullaby, evidence of life and warmth in a world that had otherwise fallen still. As they moved toward the hearth, they reached for a small clay pot set to the side. Inside it were the remnants of a simple broth made earlier in the evening, a mixture of root vegetables and dried herbs. It had cooled considerably, but the consistency remained thick, holding on to what little warmth it could. They placed it near the glowing coals, watching as a thin wisp of steam slowly began to rise. Reheating such broths was a common practice. Small, warm meals throughout the night could keep the body steady, preventing the deep chill that sometimes crept in during long winter rests. They cupped their hands near the pot, letting the faint heat seep into their fingers. For a moment, they closed their eyes, letting the warmth ease the stiffness in their joints. Winter always made the body feel older, slower, heavier. Movements became deliberate. Breaths deepened into steady, slow rhythms. Even thoughts drifted differently, wandering softly like snowflakes, caught in a gentle breeze. While the broth warmed, they tended the fire again, lifting another small piece of wood and placing it carefully among the embers. The flames caught slowly this time, curling upward in thin, fragile strands before gathering strength. Light flared softly across the room, brightening the shadows and warming the air by another small margin. They watched the fire for a long moment, mesmerized by the way the flames danced, each flicker glowing with life. In ancient times, fire was more than a source of heat. It was a companion, a guardian, a living presence that people depended on with their whole being. They spoke to fires, thanked them, prayed over them. They understood the delicate balance between flame and fuel. Tending a fire was an art, a skill passed down through generations. To let it die in the middle of winter could mean risking the well-being of everyone in the home. So fires were watched with care, fed with purpose, treated as precious. As the warmth spread, the person at the hearth ladled a small portion of broth into a wooden cup and sipped it slowly. The taste was simple but comforting, earthy, warm, familiar. With each sip a gentle calm settled deeper into their bones. They let the warmth fill them, letting their eyelids grow heavier once again. After finishing, they set the empty cup aside and turned their gaze toward a small opening near the roof, a ventilation gap for smoke to escape. Through it, they could see only darkness, but they imagined the world outside, snow still falling softly, stars hidden behind thick clouds, the moon faintly glowing behind the veil of winter sky. Sometimes, on clear nights, they would sit beneath that opening and watch the stars shimmer, their light sharp and crystalline in the cold air. But tonight, the sky offered only darkness, yet even that darkness felt familiar, like the deep, quiet belly of winter itself. Pulling the fur cloak tighter, they returned to their resting place, settling once more beside the others. They curled close to the warmth of shared bodies, letting their breath fall into the rhythm of sleep once more. Around them, the room felt like a cocoon, the fire's glow a gentle shield against the cold pressing in from outside. As they drifted back into sleep, dreams unfolded softly. They might have dreamt of green fields touched by spring sunlight, or of warm rains falling on open earth. Perhaps they dreamt of bustling market days in warmer seasons, or of walking along riverbanks unfrozen and flowing with clear water. These dreams offered comfort, gentle reminders that winter was not endless, that warmth, color, and life would return in time. While they slept, the fire continued its slow breathing, its glow deepening into a steady, warm pulse. The room shifted through tiny moments of silence and sound, the fire's crackle, the soft sigh of someone turning in their sleep, the faint groan of cold wood settling. Outside, the snow thickened further, drifting against the doorway in quiet drifts. The wind moved gently through the trees, rustling through branches heavy with frost. Far in the distance, perhaps on the edge of a frozen forest, the sound of a lone creature echoed, a fox moving through the snow, or a wolf calling softly into the night. But the sound drifted quickly into the stillness, absorbed by the vast, snowy landscape. Inside, dawn approached without light, creeping through the darkness as only winter dawns could, slow, muted, reluctant. Night did not surrender easily. It faded gradually, dissolving into a faint grayness that barely distinguished sky from earth. The cold remained deep, and the world stayed wrapped in silence. But even this faint change signaled that another day was beginning, a day of tending fires, melting snow for water, checking stored food, repairing tools, conserving energy. Winter days required focus and care, but they also held their own rituals of comfort, warm drinks, shared meals, quiet work done in the glow of firelight. For now, though, the family slept, wrapped in warmth and shadow, held gently in winter's long embrace. The fire glowed on, the cold pressed steadily, and the world waited, quietly, patiently, for the slow rise of another winter morning. The slow rise of another winter morning. Though morning in the coldest months was never sudden, never bright, never eager the way it might be in spring. Instead, winter mornings drifted into existence like a faint memory returning, gentle and pale, a quiet blur of grey that slowly seeped into the edges of the world. It came not with color, but with the softest shift in shadows, a gradual easing of darkness rather than its true absence. Inside the shelter, the change was almost imperceptible. A thin sliver of muted light filtered through the small gaps between wooden boards, touching the room in faint strokes like a painter testing the first color on a blank canvas. The fire had burned low again, its glow softer now, its embers shrinking into a warm cluster at the center of the hearth. The air inside had grown cooler, a light breath of cold hanging near the ground and brushing against the edges of sleeping blankets. One by one, the sleepers began to stir. Their movements were slow, wrapped in the softness of lingering dreams. A hand stretched, a blanket shifted. A quiet murmur drifted across the room as someone turned onto their other side. The warmth of shared bodies had kept the deep cold at bay through the long hours, but morning always brought a sharper chill, a quiet reminder that winter demanded effort even in its gentlest moments. The youngest of them blinked awake first, eyes heavy but curious, watching the faint flicker of what remained of the fire. Children in winter learned early to observe the quiet language of the hearth. They knew when the fire needed feeding, when steam rising from a pot meant warmth was coming, when the shadows on the walls meant a storm beyond the door. The child shifted closer to a parent for a moment, feeling warmth, safety, the soft beat of a familiar heart. A few breaths later, the elders awoke. Their joints stiffened easily, the cold settling into their bones more quickly than into younger bodies. But winter wisdom often lived in them, knowledge of how to keep fires alive, how to mend cloaks, how to stretch food stores, how to read the color of the frost. Rising slowly, they paused to listen to the shelter as though it were alive, as though it were whispering clues about the weather, the day ahead, the tasks waiting outside. The faintest sigh of wind brushed against the walls, carrying with it the scent of snow. Not the sharp, icy scent of a storm, but a softer, settled one, the kind that followed hours of gentle snowfall. It told them the snow had grown deep overnight, but the sky was calm now. No blizzard, no howling winds, just a landscape softened, thickened, blanketed. One of the adults moved toward the hearth, kneeling beside the cooling embers. With practiced ease, they used a small iron rod to brush aside ash, revealing the faint glow beneath. A small, patient breath coaxed the embers into brighter life, a cluster of tiny orange stars awakening. They reached for a piece of wood that had been carefully dried near the fire during the night, placing it gently across the embers. The wood caught slowly at first, then with growing confidence, until flames curled upward, forming a small, warm bloom in the dim morning light. The warmth spread through the room like a whispered promise. The cold at their feet began to retreat, inch by inch, replaced by the tender heat radiating from the rekindled flame. Someone else moved to check the drying herbs hanging from the beams, brushing their fingers lightly across leaves that rustled softly. These herbs, gathered in summer, were now precious allies, lending warmth and nourishment to the simplest winter meals. As the fire built itself into fuller strength, the group slowly rose. Cloaks were pulled tighter around shoulders, boots were slipped on with quiet determination, and hands were warmed over the growing flames. Each morning began with the same quiet ritual, awakening the fire, awakening the home, awakening themselves to another day of winter's demands. The first task of the day often involved melting snow. Even where streams existed, winter froze them solid, leaving snow as the primary source of water. Iron pots were filled with clean snow, gathered from just beyond the doorway, piled high to compensate for how little remained once the snow melted down. The pot was placed near the fire, where the warmth would slowly work its way through the frozen crystals. Steam would rise gently into the air, filling the room with the scent of clean winter. While waiting for the snow to melt, an adult stepped outside. The door opened with a low, muffled creak, pushing against the drift that had formed overnight. The moment the door cracked open, a breath of cold rushed inside, sharp and bracing, like the first inhalation upon stepping into icy water. But it was not cruel. It was simply winter doing what winter did. Outside, the world was transformed. Snow lay in deep, untouched blankets across the ground, smoothing every rough edge, every footprint, every memory of the previous day. Trees stood motionless, their branches heavy with layers of white. The sky was a pale wash of color, somewhere between silver and soft blue, the kind of sky that made sound carry strangely far and made the air feel thinner. The breath of the adult rose as a cloud before dissolving into the stillness. They stepped out carefully, feeling the snow crunch underfoot, a sound this person had heard every winter since childhood, a sound that felt as ancient as the world itself. The air tasted clean, crisp, stripped of all scents except the faintest hint of pine and cold earth buried beneath layers of frost. They surveyed the area, checking for signs of animals, checking the storage pits, checking the wooden barriers placed to keep the deepest snow away from the entrance. Everything seemed in order. Returning inside, they shook off the snow, closing the door firmly behind them. The warmth of the fire was a welcome contrast, wrapping around them like a familiar blanket. Inside, the snow in the pot had melted into clear water, and someone was already preparing a simple morning meal, perhaps porridge made from stored grains, thickened with herbs, or a small handful of dried berries, saved for moments like these. The room grew warmer by the minute. The walls, once stiff with cold, began to relax as the heat spread. Shadows danced gently across the wooden beams, flickering with the movement of the flames. Outside, the pale morning brightened slightly, though winter light always remained soft, never harsh or brilliant. After eating, the work of the day began. Winter days were short, precious, and often spent indoors, but certain tasks required tending regardless of season. Tools needed repair, hides needed scraping and softening, clothing needed patching, especially in areas that rubbed against belts, boots, or frost-hardened edges. Children helped where they could, carrying small bundles of wood, sorting dried herbs, tying string around bundles of kindling. In ancient and medieval winters, time moved differently. Tasks were slower, quieter, movements were deliberate. People saved their energy, understanding that winter was not a season to race through, but to endure with steady calm. The pace of survival had its own softness, its own patience, its own rhythm shaped by cold and darkness. As the day progressed, faint light seeped in through cracks in the walls, shifting across the floor in gentle patterns. The fire crackled softly. Warm steam drifted from the cooking pots. The sounds inside the shelter blended into a quiet harmony. The scrape of tools, the rustle of furs, the soft murmur of conversation, the distant sigh of wind. Winter outside remained vast and unmoving, but inside, the small world of the shelter pulsed with warmth and life, a fragile but determined glow against the endless cold. And as the day deepened toward another evening, the fire continued to burn, steady and loyal, guarding the fragile warmth within the ancient heart of winter. The ancient heart of winter, and as the hours drifted by, the faint light outside shifted almost imperceptibly, moving through its slow arc before beginning its gradual descent once more. Winter days were brief, more like pauses between two stretches of night than full days themselves. And so, long before anyone truly felt the fullness of afternoon, the sky had already begun to dim, its pale tones deepening into the muted grays of early evening. Inside the shelter, the fire remained steady, its heat rising in soft waves that touched faces and hands, warming the air with a gentle persistence. The room had become a little haven, a warm pocket carved out of the cold landscape, glowing softly in contrast to the chill pressing in from all sides. Work had slowed, easing into the natural quiet that winter evenings invited. Tools were set aside, bundles of herbs were hung neatly along the beams, hides were folded into careful stacks. The tasks of the day drifted to a calm finish, one by one. A soft murmur of conversation stirred through the room, the kind that came from people who had lived together through many winters, whose voices blended with the firelight and the shadows in a peaceful familiarity. No one needed to speak loudly. The room's closeness encouraged gentle tones, and the cold beyond the walls seemed to absorb any hint of harshness. Winter inspired softness in people, a quiet unity, a shared focus on warmth and survival, a gentler understanding of one another. Someone near the hearth added another piece of wood to the fire. It crackled as the dry bark caught, sending a tiny scattering of sparks into the dim air. The flames climbed along the new log with a slow, languid grace, spreading their warm glow across the room. Shadows shifted on the walls, stretching and shrinking in response, almost as if the room itself were breathing with the fire. Outside, the sky thickened with early dusk. The snow, which had softened under the faint touch of daytime, began to harden again, settling into a crisp layer across the ground. A faint breeze stirred, brushing through the trees with a whisper that sounded like the soft turning of pages in a forgotten book. Winter evenings always carried a different scent, frostier, sharper, tinged with something ancient and cold that felt older than the world itself. Within the shelter, preparations for the night began. Thick blankets were shaken out, fur coverings arranged near the hearth, cloaks hung where the heat could remove any lingering moisture gathered during brief ventures outside. A pot of evening broth simmered quietly, its aroma filling the room with warmth and comfort. It was made from stored grains, a handful of dried vegetables, and a pinch of herbs, simple but nourishing, exactly what was needed to carry them through the long winter night ahead. Children, who had spent the day helping with smaller tasks or playing quietly near the fire, began to grow sleepier as the dimming light blended with the gentle warmth. They curled closer to parents or older siblings, their small hands tucked beneath furs, their breaths deepening into soft, rhythmic sighs. The firelight danced across their peaceful faces, casting a tender glow that eased the tension from everyone's hearts. Seeing children warm, fed, and safe in winter brought a special kind of comfort, a feeling as ancient as humanity itself. As night crept in, the room returned to a quieter state. The conversations faded into a comfortable silence, broken only by the bubbling of the simmering pot and the steady crackle of the fire. The air seemed to grow softer, the atmosphere drifting into the gentle stillness that nighttime always brought. The group gathered around the fire, each settling into a familiar place. Some sat on small wooden stools, others rested directly on thick pelts spread across the floor. Everyone leaned toward the warmth, their bodies relaxing, the quietness sinking into their bones. An elder, seated closest to the fire, looked into the flames with a faraway expression. Winter evenings often brought memories with them, stories not yet told, or stories told so many times they had become woven into the fabric of the family. Without being asked, their voice rose softly, carrying a slow, steady rhythm that matched the calm beat of the flames. They spoke of winters long past, winters harsher than this one, winters when the snow had reached the rooftops and the wind had howled day after day. They spoke of ancestors who had survived by sheer will, by determination, by the warmth of community. Stories like these were not merely tales told to pass the time, they were lessons, reminders, anchors that grounded each generation in the timeless struggle of survival and resilience. While the elder spoke, the fire's glow grew deeper, richer, adding its own quiet voice to the story. Flames flickered, illuminating the listeners' faces in soft gold, their eyes reflecting tiny sparks of light. Outside, the wind strengthened slightly, brushing against the walls with a soft, sweeping hush. But inside, the warmth remained unbroken, steady, a small universe of comfort held together by fire, memory, and shared presence. When the story ended, a hush settled again, not an empty silence, but one filled with warmth, meaning, and the slow, ancient sense of continuity that winter always brought. Someone stirred the pot of broth, ladling portions into wooden bowls. The steam rose in spirals, carrying with it the scent of herbs. Each person accepted their portion with gratitude, the warmth of the bowl seeping into chilled fingers. In winter, even a simple meal felt sacred. As they ate, the sky outside deepened into night, true winter night, thick and heavy, woven from darkness and frost. The sounds of the world grew distant. Even the wind softened, as if retreating into deeper cold. Snowflakes drifted past the small window slit, glowing faintly white against the shadowed world, like tiny spirits moving through the air. Inside, the last of the broth was shared, bowls set aside, and blankets, and the cold, ancient world pressed closer as the night deepened, settling itself around the small shelter like a vast, silent sea of frost. The wind, which had quieted for a time, began to rise again, not in fierce gusts but in long, slow breaths that drifted through the trees, brushing the snow-covered branches in soft, whispering strokes. Each exhale of wind stirred faint spirals of powder across the ground, shifting the edges of drifts with such delicate motion that it seemed the earth itself was breathing beneath its heavy winter blanket. Inside, the sleepers lay wrapped in dreams as soft as the furs covering them. Their breaths mingled with the faint crackle of the hearth, creating a gentle harmony that filled the dimness like a lullaby. The fire glowed with a quiet steadiness now, its flames gathered low but strong, flickering in slow, hypnotic rhythms that cast warm pulses of light across the wooden walls. Shadows moved in easy waves, stretching and curling, weaving themselves into the room like silent companions. One of the adults stirred faintly, though they did not fully wake, just shifted slightly closer to the warmth of the fire, instinctively seeking its gentle glow. Their movement dislodged a small drift of warmth that drifted across the floorboards, brushing lightly against the cold air still lingering in the corners. Winter nights were always filled with these tiny, instinctive motions, small adjustments that kept the body warm, safe, and aligned with the slow heartbeat of the fire. The cold outside had grown sharper, more crystalline. Frost thickened on the beams and shutters, forming delicate patterns that looked like tiny branching trees etched across the wood. These frost patterns were familiar to those living through winter. Some believed they were messages from the spirits of the cold, marking the home with their presence. In certain ancient traditions, families studied these frost shapes in the morning, tracing them with their fingertips to see what stories the night had woven. As the fire breathed steadily on, the world outside slipped deeper into its frozen quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a faint crack echoed the sound of ice shifting on a frozen stream, adjusting under the weight of deepening cold. The sound carried through the stillness, thin and distant, but unmistakable. Such noises were a normal part of winter, a reminder that even frozen things continued to move, to stretch, to breathe in their own slow, ancient way. A few moments later, a soft rustle stirred within the shelter. A child, half dreaming, shifted beneath a fur blanket, their small hands curling as they murmured something unintelligible. Their breath created tiny clouds of warmth against the cool air, and for a moment, the firelight caught the faint mist, making it glow softly before it vanished. A parent, still mostly asleep, instinctively reached out and pulled the blanket more securely over the child, tucking them into the warm cocoon that kept the cold at bay. Through the narrow roof vent, a thin wisp of smoke drifted into the night, dissolving quickly into the cold air outside. The vent allowed the fire to breathe, to draw in fresh air and release its faint plume into the sky. The scent of burning wood rose faintly above the shelter, mixing with the crisp scent of frost and pine. Anyone walking nearby, though the world was empty at this hour, would have recognized the smell immediately, the unmistakable scent of life within winter's cold silence. Far beyond the shelter, in the deep forests, animals moved quietly beneath the trees. A deer, its breath forming a white halo around its muzzle, stepped carefully through the snow, pausing now and then to listen for predators hidden by darkness. A fox, sleek and cautious, trotted lightly across the frozen ground, its paws barely making a sound as it searched for small prey beneath the snow. Even the wolves, who traveled with their packs through the long night, moved silently, their presence marked more by the soft imprint of paw prints than by sound. But none of these distant sounds or movements reached the shelter with any urgency. They were all part of winter's vast tapestry, a quiet dance of life, moving slowly, carefully, beneath the heavy sky. The people inside remained untouched by these distant motions, protected by their walls, their fire, and the shared warmth of one another. Hours passed like slow-moving rivers under ice, sliding quietly, unnoticed, into the deeper part of the night. The fire, though calm, needed tending eventually, and it was one of the adults who woke first to this gentle duty. Their eyes opened softly, adjusting to the dim glow of embers, and for a moment they simply lay still, listening. The fire's whispers, the slow breathing of sleepers, the faint wind pressing against the walls, these sounds told them the balance of warmth and cold, safety and danger, rest and readiness. Rising carefully so as not to disturb the others, they stepped toward the hearth. The floor beneath them was cold, even through the thick fur lining, and they moved with quiet deliberation. Kneeling by the fire, they brushed away a thin layer of ash from the embers, revealing the small but steady glow beneath. With practiced ease, they placed a new piece of wood on top, not too large, for the fire needed to grow gently, and added a small handful of twigs to encourage the flame. The fire responded slowly, as though waking from its own slumber. A faint flicker rose, catching on the dry bark. The flames curled upward, small at first, then steadier, bringing renewed warmth into the room. The adults sat for a moment, warming their hands, feeling the slow return of heat seep into their skin. They closed their eyes briefly, letting the glow relax the stiffness that had settled into their body during the long hours of rest. As the fire grew brighter, the room warmed once more. Shadows shifted across the walls, lengthening and shrinking with the movement of the flames. The person tending the fire glanced around the shelter, checking each sleeping figure with quiet affection. All were resting peacefully, wrapped in the shared warmth of furs and blankets. seeing this, brought a small smile, a silent gratitude that the night had been kind so far. They returned to their spot beside the others, lying down carefully to preserve the warmth. The fire's glow brushed gently across their face as their eyes closed again. Sleep returned quickly, soft and heavy, pulling them back into its calm embrace. Outside, the night reached its quietest point, a stillness so deep that even the whisper of snowflakes falling seemed loud in comparison. The world was suspended in cold silence, the kind of silence that touched every surface, every branch, every breath. The stars overhead glimmered faintly through thin patches of cloud, their light distant and icy, like ancient watchful eyes peering down through the frost. Time moved slowly, but it moved all the same, and as the deep night wore on, the fire continued to breathe, the wind continued its quiet wandering, and the world held its long, patient vigil beneath winter's heavy cloak. But deep inside the shelter, warmth persisted. The ancient, flickering heart of fire kept alive the fragile thread of comfort, weaving it softly through the darkness, carrying the sleepers toward the faint glimmer of another dawn waiting far beyond the frozen horizon. And that far horizon, though hidden behind layers of darkness and drifting cloud, was slowly pulling the night onward, guiding it step by step toward morning. Yet for now, the night still held dominion over the land, wrapping everything in its vast, frozen quiet. The cold had become heavier in the hours before dawn, settling like a weight across the earth, pressing into the trees, the stones, the fields of snow that lay smooth and untouched beneath the pale light of the stars. Inside the shelter, the fire continued its slow whispering, the flames shifting in gentle curves that illuminated the sleeping shapes curled beneath fur blankets. The air glowed with a soft, muted warmth, not the hot crackling heat of a great blaze, but a steady, comforting warmth that radiated outward in slow waves. It was enough to keep the cold at bay, enough to let the sleepers drift deeper into dreams. One of the children stirred, blinking briefly at the faint amber glow. Their eyes were heavy, unfocused, drifting between waking and sleep. For a moment they sat up slightly, their breath rising in a small mist that shimmered in the firelight. And they listened, not to anything specific, but simply to the quiet. The shelter's silence was layered, a mixture of soft breaths, distant wind, and the low heartbeat of fire. It was a silence that felt protective, ancient, as though generations of winter nights had woven themselves into its walls. The child lay back down slowly, their small hands curling around the edge of the blanket. Sleep folded over them again with the ease of a familiar cloak. Outside the walls, unseen, snowflakes drifted gently from the sky, settling in soft layers upon the roof. Each flake landed with silent precision, joining the countless others that had fallen during the long hours of darkness. Snow built up like soft feathers, thickening the insulation that helped keep the warmth inside. Winter always offered small gifts like this, nature forming its own blanket over the homes of those who lived through the coldest months. In the forest nearby, the night creatures continued their quiet wanderings. An owl perched high on a bare branch shifted slightly, its feathers puffed up against the cold. Its wide eyes scanned the silent ground below, searching for the faintest movement. When none came, it remained still, waiting with the patience born from countless winter hunts. Farther away, a wolf lifted its head to the wind, sniffing the air. The pack was resting for now, gathered in a sheltered hollow, conserving their strength for the long journey ahead. Their breaths rose in thin clouds, mingling together in the dimness. But in the shelter, time flowed differently. It flowed not by the motion of animals or the shifting wind, but by the slow fading and brightening of the fire. The flames, which had grown stronger when they were tended hours before, were now beginning to sink again, settling into a bed of warm embers. The glow softened, dimming toward a deep red. The warmth remained, but it stretched thinner, reaching only a little way into the cool air that crept in from the edges of the room. This subtle shift was enough to stir one of the adults, who had slept lightly for much of the night. They opened their eyes to the faint reddish glow, and felt the thinness of the warmth. Without fully rising, they reached toward the small pile of wood beside them. The movement was slow, almost dreamlike, as their hand found a piece of dry wood, and gently laid it onto the embers. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a tiny thread of smoke curled upward, followed by the faintest flicker of flame. The person watched with quiet attentiveness, not rushing the fire, letting it grow in its own gradual rhythm. The flames licked softly at the bark, spreading their light until the shadows began to shift more broadly across the walls. When the fire had regained enough strength, the adults settled back down, letting the renewed warmth drift over them. Their eyes remained open for a few minutes, simply observing the gentle world around them. In the dim firelight, everything seemed softened, the wooden beams glowing faintly, the sleeping forms rising and falling in slow motion, the frost outside the shuttered windows casting delicate patterns where the cold pressed against the warm interior. These moments, quiet and unhurried, were part of the rhythm of winter life. Nights were long, but they were filled with countless small rituals of care, tending the fire, adjusting blankets, listening to the wind, ensuring that the fragile balance between warmth and cold was maintained. Slowly, their eyes drifted closed again, the fire's glow still flickering against their eyelids. Sleep reclaimed them gently, like drifting down into a warm pool of still water. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint, distant sound, the soft creak of ancient trees leaning in the cold. The forest had its own language during winter nights, a collection of groans, sighs, and whispers that echoed softly through the frozen landscape. These sounds were older than the people who lived within the shelter, older than the wooden beams, older even than many of the traditions passed down through generations. They were the voice of winter itself, speaking in quiet tones that only the patient could hear. Time passed, and in that slow passing, the sky began to change. It was not dawn yet, nowhere near, but the blackness of night softened almost imperceptibly, a faint thinning of the darkness near the horizon, as though the night were exhaling after holding its breath for many hours. The stars dimmed just slightly, their icy light becoming gentler. It was the first distant sign that the world was slowly, steadily turning toward morning. Inside the shelter, the warmth had strengthened once more. The fire, now burning with a renewed gentle energy, filled the room with a soft amber glow. The air felt more comfortable, and the cold no longer seeped so heavily around the edges. The furs and blankets cradled the sleepers in a cocoon of comfort, keeping them safe against the frigid world lying just beyond the door. One of the adults dreamed of walking through a snow-covered field, the sky above vast and pale, the wind brushing softly across their face. The dream felt peaceful, familiar, like a memory from childhood or a story told on long winter nights. Another dreamed of sitting beside a larger hearth, surrounded by friends and family, the room filled with laughter and warm food. Winter dreams were often like this, simple, quiet, filled with warmth and longing. At the far end of the shelter, a tiny sound stirred the air, a faint tapping, almost like the brush of a fingertip against wood. It repeated once, then again. It was nothing alarming, just the settling of the wooden walls contracting in the cold. But in winter, people learned to listen to every sound, to understand their meanings. This tapping meant the temperature outside was dropping even lower, tightening the wood, making it shift slightly under pressure. It was another reminder of nature's presence, steady and unchanging. The tapping faded, swallowed by the surrounding quiet. The night settled again into its deep stillness, holding its breath as time crept onward. Hours slipped by, each one blending into the next with soft, seamless ease. The fire was tended once more, this time by another adult, whose turn had come without words needing to be spoken. They added wood, stirred the embers gently, and sat close for a few minutes to absorb the warmth. Their thoughts drifted peacefully, floating like soft snow through the quiet of the room. When they returned to their place, the fire glowed brighter, stronger, the warmth deepened, pushing back the lingering cold that clung to the corners. The sleepers sighed softly in their rest, shifting a little as the comfortable heat reached them once more. Outside, clouds began to gather, thin and silvery, drifting across the sky like slow-moving rivers. Snowflakes fell intermittently, swirling down in gentle spirals that caught the faint starlight. The world was wrapped in a soft haze of falling snow, each flake unique, delicate, vanishing the moment it touched the warm breath of life. The horizon brightened again very slightly, very far away, hinting that dawn was drawing nearer. But still the night held its place, lingering with the patience of something ancient and powerful. Winters in ancient times were long, demanding resilience, patience, and the steady, unbroken rhythm of tending the fire, sleeping in shared warmth, and trusting the rituals that kept life safe. Deep inside the shelter, the people slept on, wrapped in warmth, while the world outside lay frozen and waiting. The balance held steady, warmth within, cold without, as the night continued its slow journey toward the first pale shimmer of morning light. And though that pale shimmer was still distant, still hidden behind thick layers of cloud and drifting snow, its promise lingered quietly at the edge of the world, like a soft glow waiting to unfold. The night carried on with its deep stillness, settling itself around the shelter in steady, patient silence. Winter had a way of slowing everything, stretching each hour into long, gentle threads that drifted into one another without hurry or urgency. Inside the shelter, the fire continued its quiet breathing, the flames swaying in soft curves that painted the wooden walls with warm amber light. The shadows shifted slowly, rising and falling as though they, too, were caught in the rhythm of sleep. The air was filled with that same steady warmth, delicate, persistent, weaving itself through every corner of the room and wrapping itself around each sleeping form. One of the older adults lay awake now, though they did not move. Their eyes were open only slightly, watching the faint flicker of the fire with calm, unhurried attention. They listened to the soft breaths of their family, to the distant sigh of the wind against the roof, to the quiet settling of the wooden beams. All these sounds, familiar and gentle, were part of a winter symphony that had accompanied countless nights like this one. They knew the cold outside was deep tonight, perhaps deeper than any night so far in this long season. The way the wood creaked, the faintness of the stars through the clouded sky, the dryness of the air that slipped in through the tiny cracks, all these small signs spoke of bitter frost pressing close, but they also knew the fire was strong, the furs warm, and the shelter sturdy. Winter could be harsh, but people had learned its language, its patterns, its quiet warnings, and so even on a night like this, there was comfort in the knowledge that they were safe. Their gaze drifted across the room to where the youngest child slept curled into a small bundle, one tiny hand resting outside the blanket. They watched the slow rise and fall of the child's breath, the softness of their dreams evident in their peaceful stillness. Moments like this, surrounded by the warmth and life of family, made even the harshest winter nights feel gentle, bearable, almost tender. After a while, the adults' eyes closed again, though they remained lightly awake, drifting in that soft space between rest and awareness. This half-sleep was common in winter, a kind of shared vigilance passed from generation to generation, ensuring that someone was always near to the fire, always listening. Outside, the wind shifted once more, brushing through the trees with a long, low murmur. Snowflakes drifted sideways, caught in the slow swirl of the breeze. They settled across the frozen ground like tiny stars fallen from the sky, each one unique, each one shining faintly before merging into the growing blanket of white. Farther in the forest, a family of deer moved softly through the trees, their hooves crunching faintly in the powdery snow. They traveled with quiet intention, seeking a sheltered place to rest before the dawn. Their breaths came out in pale clouds, vanishing quickly in the cold air. Nearby, a small hare paused, its ears twitching as it listened for danger. Its fur, thick and white for winter, blended almost perfectly into the snow, offering protection from eyes that might be watching. The forest was alive in its own quiet way, but all of its movements were slow, gentle, careful, the way life always moved in the heart of winter. Inside the shelter, the fire crackled softly as another piece of wood caught flame, breaking open with a faint snap. The sound was enough to stir one of the middle-aged adults, who stretched slowly beneath their blanket, blinking in the warm glow. They sat up slightly, rubbing their eyes, then looked around the room with the soft, heavy gaze of someone waking peacefully. They rose quietly, stepping toward the hearth with slow, practiced motions. The warmth embraced them immediately, brushing against their skin like a gentle hand. They crouched beside the fire, studying the flames for a moment. The fire was steady, but the night was still long, and so they added another log, placing it carefully so as not to collapse the delicate structure of the burning wood. As the new log settled into place, a small swirl of sparks danced upward, glowing briefly before fading into the air. The adult watched them drift away, then reached for a nearby clay pot filled with water, tapping it gently to check if any ice had formed near the rim. The warmth of the fire had kept it from freezing, and they took a small sip, feeling the cool water refresh their throat before returning the pot to its place. They stretched their hands toward the fire again, absorbing the gentle heat that spread slowly up their arms. In ancient winters, these small moments of warmth were precious little islands of comfort within the vast cold. People learned to savor them, to let the heat seep deep into their bones, restoring the strength needed to face the days and nights ahead. After a quiet minute, the adults sat back down near the others, the firelight flickering softly across their face. They adjusted the blankets of a younger sibling who had shifted in their sleep, tucking the furs around them securely. These small gestures were part of winter life, acts of care woven into the rhythm of survival. The sky outside continued its slow transformation. Though night still held firm, the darkness was now lighter than before, tinged with the faintest whisper of grey. Winter dawns often crept in like this, not with sudden brightness, but with gentle hints that built slowly over time. Clouds drifted overhead in thick, pale layers, carrying the promise of more snow. Each cloud moved at a slow, steady pace, like great ships sailing through the quiet sky. A distant cracking sound echoed faintly, the ice on a far-off stream shifting beneath the pressure of deep cold. The sound traveled through the frozen air, reaching the shelter as a thin, distant note. Inside, the sleepers did not stir. The sound was familiar, part of the natural language of winter landscapes. The fire burned steadily, its light deepening into a warmer glow as more wood caught flame. The room brightened slightly, casting long, soft shadows that stretched across the floor. The warmth grew stronger, filling the air with a soothing calmness that made the blankets even more inviting. One of the older children murmured in their sleep, turning slowly onto their side. A strand of hair fell across their face, and the gentle heat from the fire illuminated it like a thread of gold. Their dream continued, untouched, filled with whatever soft visions the winter night had woven for them. Hours continued to pass in quiet sequence. The fire was tended again, though each tending required only small adjustments, a piece of wood here, a gentle stirring there. The night outside moved gradually toward dawn, but the shelter held its own timeless rhythm, unhurried and serene. In many ancient cultures, winter nights like this were considered sacred times, when the world was at its calmest. When the boundary between the waking world and the dream world grew thin, people told stories of spirits wandering through the forests on the coldest nights, of ancestors whispering through the